Hi, this is how to model some stupid shoes or whatever using Fusion 360. Alright, so before we begin, I've got a couple disclaimers. First, very little effort was put into the design process of this shoe, so the focus here won't be on design. Also, this is the first shoe I've ever tried to make, so I've made some mistakes and I'll try and call them out as we go. And finally, I should also note that this is not meant to be a comprehensive step-by-step guide to shoe modeling. I just wanted to share some modeling techniques that I've seen some people use, but not very many people talk about. So, hope it's helpful, and let's begin. Alright, so I started by bringing in a model of a foot. I think I got this guy off of GrabCAD. If you have a SAT or a step file, any kind of surface or solid model, you have to upload it to your project folder, and then you can open it. That's what this guy is right here. And what I'm doing here is I'm scaling this, rotating it, making sure that it's in the right orientation and scale for what I'm working with. And you can also create a sketch with dimensions to check and see if the dimensions are correct. And here I'm going to do a non-proportional scale to scale it to the dimensions that I just created. And when we're done messing around here, we're going to export this as an STL file. You can do that by right-clicking on the body and say save as an STL, and save out the mesh as low resolution because we're only going to be using this as a reference. So here in a new file, we're going to import our foot that we just exported. To do this, you need to create a base feature, and then you can go insert, and you can insert your STL file. That's this guy right here. We're going to do a couple checks here to make sure that it's in the right orientation. It actually wasn't in this particular case. I actually had to rotate this so that the top is top, front is front, all that stuff. So you will only be able to manipulate this mesh when you're in the base feature. Once you get out of the base feature, this will be kind of a locked object in your model tree. So it's best that if you have to do any manipulation or modification to this mesh file, you do it while you're still in the base feature. And here I'm just rotating this guy into place. So when we're done with all that, we're going to exit our base feature, and then we're going to start creating the model. So we're going to start our model by entering the Sculpt environment. And we'll start by creating a plane that is 1x1 face. And we're going to just use this, and we're going to manipulate this until we create the base of the shoe. Getting the first plane into place. And now I'm just alt dragging and creating the ring around the ankle and bridging the end here. Continuing to manipulate the top, and then we're going to alt drag down. Kind of getting the rough shape to start with. We're just welding when necessary and bridging when necessary. Now we're just closing off the bottom. So some people would probably like to create this model starting with a box and manipulating the box, and that's okay. I just tend to like having a more direct manipulation, so I start with a plane. So now it's just tweaking the vertices and making sure that the form is what we want. And this can be as long or as short of a process as you would like. To be quite honest, I would have rather spent a little bit more time here because this ultimately is what's going to define the end shape of the shoe. So if you get this right, then the better the shoe will be. It would have also been nice to have found a cleaner topology for this mesh. Ultimately, the topology is what's going to determine the cleanliness of the resulting surface after we exit this sculpting environment. And here I'm just continuing to manipulate, trying to get these things into shape. Here I switched over into the different display mode. This is polygonal mode, so I can check and see how the underlying mesh is actually shaping up. Manipulating some things here to make sure that the mesh will result in a clean surface. And when we're done, we're just going to turn it back into smooth mode. And just continue tweaking here. And then when we get out of sculpting mode, we have our surface. Now if we go into patch mode, we can go in here, we can flip the normal so we can see it correctly. And then create a copy of the surface body so that we can keep our original intact while we continue to model. And now I'm going to go back into creating another T-spline body. In this case, we're going to create a feature for trimming out the top of the shoe. Just going to insert an edge here at this point up here so that I can get a little bit tighter curvature. I'm also going to create a plane up here to trim out the top section. And now when we exit the sculpt environment, we're going to try and trim out. I actually made a mistake here. There was a portion of this body that didn't intersect, so I had to go back into the T-spline body and manipulate so that it intersected. And now we're just trimming out some of the sections. And again, this is trimmed off of the copy of the original body that we made. The original body is still intact. Now we're just going to make another copy of it. We're going to make another layer of the shoe. Do kind of a similar thing. We can actually see the other body in this view, so we're going to use that as a reference, but I'm going to manipulate this so that it goes a little bit further out. Again, I'm going to use this to trim out this layer, and that's the tongue. And now we're going to use the thicken command to thicken the tongue, make this into a solid body. Just moving the face down, fill it in the edges. Now we're thickening the first layer. Now we're going to create an offset of the original surface. We're going to start creating the next layer of the shoe using some of the references we already have for trimming out some stuff. Now we're going to go back into the sculpt environment, create some more surfaces for trimming out this particular layer. Just trimming out this layer. Going to thicken this layer as well. I didn't like how the resulting body turned out, so I actually am going back and editing this sculpt. That's the benefit of having this be parametric. Just making some quick tweaks here. Trim this guy out. So I'm adding a couple fillets here, but in the end these are actually going to be hidden, so ultimately these don't really matter all that much. So there were a couple things I didn't quite like, so I'm just going back into the history tree and making a few changes. Cleaning up the curvature a little bit. A couple things broke in history, so I had to go back and fix them, but it turned out okay. And now we'll offset the original body again for the outer layer. Go back into our sculpt environment, create a new sculpt. And now we're going to create our trimming surface for this outer layer. So I started this particular one with creating a sketch on the side view. And I started with a spline, which in the end actually turned out to be kind of a mistake, because I'm trying here to create some lines that are referenced to a single center point. But what happens is when I go back in here and I trim, all the references end up getting lost. So the spline geometry that I created when I re-reference this to the center point, it all kind of gets broken. So what I ended up doing is just deleting all the spline profiles, extending these lines, creating new splines, and then trimming them out. And you'll see that in a minute here. Again, getting all these in position using angular constraints. Now I'm going back in here with the spline, and here's where we're going to start trimming them out. Now this top spline here, this also turned out to be kind of a mistake, because I ended up not even trimming out the top with a spline from this direction, but I went from the top view and trimmed out from the top view in the end. And now we're just trimming out all of our geometry here. Now this is actually bad practice. What should be happening is I should have used the untrimmed geometry and created a new sketch that references it, so we could go back and edit if we wanted to, but I was impatient. So here I'm just extruding this profile in the T-spline body. I'm selecting the bottom edges and I'm uncreasing these so that they become a soft profile. I'm going to be adding another segment through the center so that I can have a little tighter curvature. And since these shoes are asymmetric, I'm actually going in here and selecting both sides and kind of moving these to the corresponding positions at the intersection point. So now we get out of our T-spline body, we use these guys to trim out the outside surface that we created before. And here's where I realized that I should have trimmed out the top from the top view. So what I'm actually doing is I'm modifying the T-spline body to kind of be overbuilt so that when it trims, it goes all the way across. And now I'm going to go in and create a new T-spline body for trimming out the top view. So now we're going to create yet another T-spline body so that we can trim out from the top. This is the same as we did from before. A better way to go about this would have probably been to create one master geometry for the top profile and then use offsets for each layer. That way if I went back and I wanted to change the profile of the top cut profile for any of the layers, it would all be referenced from each other. But I was trying to go as quickly as possible, so I went for a more direct approach. So there we have the outside surface of the shoe. Now we're going to start thickening this and then adding some detail. So we're going to be creating some piping along this top edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a plane on path. I'm going to create a circular profile on that plane. And then I'm going to sweep along that top edge. I'm going to combine that with the body below. And to make a couple tweaks here because it actually coincided with the inside edge. It was creating not so happy geometry there. And we're just going to fill at some of the edges. Now we're going to create some hollow piping on the outer layer for the shoelace to go through. Now this is probably one of the bigger mistakes that I made on this model, because what's going to happen is I'm going to have to create swept profiles for each of these individual sections. And what I could have done is made one single sweep along the whole entire top edge before the cuts from the side. That way I would have only had to do this once and not 10 times or whatever I have to do here. And now I'm going to go in and make a few extensions so that they go a little bit further beyond the cuts from the side. Selecting all of these, moving these out. I think it was like 0.2 millimeters or something like that. I'm just doing a shell here, selecting both sides so it goes all the way through. And now I'm just combining these with the outside body. I wanted to make this outer layer just a little bit thicker, so I went back into the history and I made this about 0.5 millimeter thicker. And then when this builds, it's actually going to break quite a few things, but I'm just going to go back and edit some of these features to fix it. It actually wasn't too bad. Making sure all the fillets build correctly. And now we're going to be adding a few extra fillets to the trims from the side. This one's a little bit more finicky. Some of these I had to go around and select all of the individual segments. If I built the very original surface in a cleaner way with a cleaner topology, this wouldn't actually be an issue. But this is a quick workaround by just selecting all of the individual segments. And here I'm just quickly changing the appearance of one of the bodies, just so that I can use it as a reference for the next step of the modeling process. I'm going to create a quick spline profile and use this to trim out the top section here. I hid the tongue here just to make sure that it didn't cut through that as well. And again, we're creating another plane along a path for our next swept profile. And sweep along that edge. And I actually went back and edited the sketch a little bit so that it did more what I wanted it to do. I cut out one of the sides so that I could fillet this and add the detail that I wanted. And here I'm just going to change the color real quick to make sure it matches up with the layer of the shoe. And now we're going to begin working on the sole. If I were to do this again, I probably would have done this a lot earlier on in the modeling process. That way I could have matched some things a little bit better. But here I am, I'm creating a sketch from the top view. This is going to be extruded in the T-spline body. The spline actually doesn't have to be that accurate because we're going to end up tweaking it quite a bit. Here we're just moving everything and trying to make sure that the intersection between this surface and the outer surface of the shoe match up in a nice way. That's the trickiest part, is really trying to figure out how these guys match up. Now we're going to move everything down just a little bit because we're going to overbuild and then trim out the bottom. Just went into a wireframe view to see how much room we have underneath of the body of the shoe. Creating a sketch for the side profile trim. Just tweaking the spline here. I'm going to extrude this and then modify it a little bit so that it matches up with the bottom of the shoe. And now we're going to leave our sculpting environment, start making some preliminary trims and see how things actually ended up matching up. I'm taking the original surface, offsetting that. I'm going to be using this to trim the top of the sole. Just using the trim tool. Trim out the bottom, trim out the top. And then we start seeing our geometry, which at this point is pretty wonky. So we're going to go back in the history a little bit and modify the T-spline body. And we're just going to continue to modify this thing until we get to a point where we're happy with all the intersections. Here I'm just doing a quick measurement using a line from the side view. And here, as I'm continuing to edit the side profiles here, I'm noticing that the tangencies are actually starting to break. So I'm actually going in there in the vertex mode and linking all the handles on for the outside edges. This is one of my most aggravating things about T-splines. I would actually rather have them always be linked, and I figure out a way to deal with them otherwise, but so be it. And just continuing to go around and modify these profiles. And when we're finally happy with these, we'll combine all of the surfaces together, knit them together, create a solid body. And now we're going to begin working on the detail of how these guys combine with the main body of the shoe. Just going to create a side trim profile. Going to create a offset of, again, our original surface body, and use that to merge with the bottom of the shoe. So I'm just using this to trim out that body. Thickening this surface here, and then I'll combine this with the sole that we've created. just adding some fillets at the front edge here. Kind of make it merge together a little bit better. Filleting the side. Adding some final radii here. And as I was looking at this and viewing this from the side view, I decided that it was too flat not to be completely flat, so I'm just taking this trim body and flattening this guy out. So now the main portion of our sole is more or less done at this point, and we're just going to begin to add some details on the bottom. So for creating the detail on the bottom of the shoe, first we're going to copy some of the reference geometry that we've used before. For example, the bottom trim profile. And now we're going to create a sketch from the bottom, and we're just going to offset some of the geometry that we have. So we're going to offset this, and then we're going to trim out some of the top because I don't want the offset to go all the way to the top. And then I'm going to create a spline, and unfortunately I couldn't get this to be tangent with the offset geometry, so I'm just going to eyeball it and then fillet the hell out of it. And here I am creating those big fillets, kind of combining that together, just creating a couple offsets here, and then we're going to extrude this geometry as a new body. Have a couple of these going in both directions. I'm going to be using some of our reference geometry to trim out the top and the bottom of this. Making sure the offset isn't too much so that it goes through the shoe. Now we're splitting the body. And then we're just going to remove the top and bottom sections that we don't need. For defining part of how we're going to cut this sole, I'm actually going to take some of this geometry, copy it, and move it around a little bit, and then we're going to use this to trim out the top of this particular section. Get it into place, and then we're going to split it, and then we're going to remove it. And you can see here that there's a little bit of an issue. One of the sections is cutting a little too high. It's actually cutting through the sole. So just modifying that profile, and now it's fine. we're going to create the tread detail. I'm starting by taking some of the geometry that we have and projecting that onto our current sketch. And we're going to be using this to trim out the edge of some of our sketch geometry that we're going to make. So just creating one profile, and then I'm going to create a radial pattern from a point that we're going to create right there. Specify the angle and the amount. And then we're going to extrude all of these profiles. So select all these profiles and extrude in both directions. And now we're going to use our reference geometry to trim off the top and bottom like we did before. After splitting, we'll go in there and select all of the geometry that we want to remove from the model and say remove. And then we can combine this and then do a fillet. Go all the way around here. Do some final detail fillets. And that's about it for the sole. So now we're just going to create the detail for the back seam of the shoe. I'm just referencing doing an offset of the original geometry, trimming off a couple sections, and then we will trim the back and thicken it. Just doing a quick trim here. Trim both sides, and we have our back detail. We thicken this guy. Do a couple fillets. And that's about it for that. I'm just going back and making a couple changes to the radii here. So now we're going to start working on the laces. I'm just going to be creating a T-spline body to reference the center point of the lace. So we're going to create this geometry, trying to keep as close to the center of the pipes as possible. Again, adjusting both sides. So here we have our reference geometry. And I'm going to go in there and create a sketch from the top view. And I'm just going to be using a spline and going through all of these. And I'm going to terminate it toward the end of half of the path. And I'm doing this because if we create a single line, the intersections will actually cause problems in the future. So I'm going to create two separate spline entities. And just making sure that our sketch goes beyond our reference geometry. Now we're going to create a split line on two copies of our reference geometry. So we end up with two reference geometries with the spline profile that we created in our sketch. And now I'm creating a separate sketch, and I'm including the 3D geometry of each of these two. And now we have our spline profile, or a 3D spline profile that goes around the whole thing. And now we're going to go into Sculpt mode and create pipes based on these sketches. So now we have T-spline bodies that use that underlying sketch. Now we're going to go in there and we're going to tweak this T-spline body to make sure that it is on the center of each of these sections. And now we're going to be working on the overlap of the laces. I'm just going in there and double clicking the rings and getting rid of some of the profiles so it's easier to edit, and just moving up the center section. And now we'll exit the sculpt mode, flip the geometry if necessary, and we're going to change the color of these guys to black to see if there's any overlap or anything that's poking through. And there's a couple of these, so I'm going to go back into the T-spline body and edit this a little bit, make sure that nothing pokes out. It looks pretty good, except for a couple at the top, which I'll end up editing a little bit later. And now I'm just creating an offset plane from the top plane. This is going to represent the ground. And now I'll create a sketch on this top plane, just a quick spline. And then I'm going to use the move command to turn this into a 3D spline. Just taking these segments, moving them up, trying to match these guys as close as possible. Try and make these splines look a little bit natural, but I don't know if I succeeded in that or not. And when we're finally happy with these splines, we'll use the pipe command again. Create both sides. And now I'll go in and combine these with the other geometry here. I just used the bridge command and then started to edit. Do the other side here. I'm actually using the Weld Vertices command on this side. I found it was a little bit easier. And then I'm just capping the ends here so that they can turn into solid geometry. Making a few extra edits to this top profile. And here we're just going to create a couple quick planes at the end of these laces so that we can create the little hard caps at the end of the laces. And now the shoe is mostly done. The last thing I want to do is add some stitching detail. So I'm going to again offset the original base geometry to the outside. Create a sketch from the side view. And then just start sketching wherever I want the stitching to be. Now a much smarter way to have done this would have been to just take some of our original reference geometry and offset it, use that as a trim profile. But when I was doing this, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with the stitching, so I just kind of started sketching, and this is where I ended up. So that's the first half, but since our shoe is not symmetric, we're going to copy this to the other side. We're just going to create another sketch and start going at it from the other direction. modifying our profile to match the second half. We're going to extrude each half separately. Do the other side. Do all the trims that I had on the other side on this side too. I didn't really do this side right because it doesn't quite match the other half, but oh well. I'm just going to add some fillets to the top edges of these surfaces. And now we're going to trim out the center section of our reference geometry and use that to trim out. So this is most of the way done, but what I want to do is I want to merge and loft from one side of these to the other, so this is one surface. That way when I create the sweep that goes around here, it goes around the whole thing, not just half. There was some bad geometry at the bottom, so I just trimmed it off because I was lazy. Creating a plane along the path, sketching on that surface. Initially I was actually going to create real stitches and create a pattern along the path, but it ended up not quite liking it and crashing the computer, so I just said screw it and swept along the whole entire path. And that's pretty much the end of the model. There's some other things we can do, which I'll show you in a minute here, but here's our entire thing. We're going to delete all of our reference geometry at the end, just so it makes a cleaner file. I can add some materiality to it. And then if we want, we can go into render mode and render this guy in Fusion. I'm not a particular fan of the render quality of Fusion, but we can if we want to. In a minute here I'll show you how to bring this guy into a external renderer, get a little bit higher quality renders out of it. And just really quick, I'm going to show you a couple things that you might want to do with this model. I'm just going to create an offset plane from the side view, and then you can create a mirror to the other side, so you can have a left and a right shoe. That's one thing you can do with it. You can right click and you can export any of these bodies as an STL file. You can also export OBJ files from Fusion, but it's a little bit tricky. You have to go into base feature and then convert the solid body into a mesh, and then the OBJ export option will be available to you. You can also create a quick photo studio by creating a ground plane and then creating a back surface and then filleting that to become an infinity plane. Make sure this is curvature continuous, otherwise when you render you're going to see a curvature break. Now I'm just creating a couple large planes to be used as softbox lights for the studio. Move these around into position wherever you want them. You can extend this guy out a little bit, and there we have our studio. So now I'm going to export all of these bodies, and since I'm using Octane I need to export OBJ files, but I find the easiest way to do that is actually to export STL files through Mesh Mixer and use Mesh Mixer to create OBJ files. If you want to export a solid or surface file, you can just export a SAT or a step file very easily. You can also, if you have programs like 3D Studio Max, you can bring in the entire scene into that with just one file, rather than what I'm doing here, which is creating each individual file for each part. So that's all of our parts, and now we're just going to bring these guys into Octane. It's going to link these guys up into a single scene, and after we put some ugly textures on there, we have our final shoe.